Right, so next up we have Ngaire McCarthy. Now, Ngaire was sworn in as a Justice of the Peace in 1985. And while she was stood in line to be sworn in, and they were told they had to raise their hand and swear allegiance to the Queen, obviously under oath, saying, I don't know, something about God. Anyway, as both an atheist and a Republican, Ngaire decided to put her hands behind her back and cross her fingers. I salute you, Ngaire. Ngaire would like to come back as a tui because they're family-orientated, busy and bossy. Welcome, Ngaire, please.
Kia ora tātou. When I was approached to give a kōrero about what it's like being a Maori rationalist from a Maori perspective, I was surprised. Being a rationalist, an atheist, a skeptic and a humanist, to me all these things are innate. It's just part of who I am. However, I know that there is a general public misconception that all Maori are religious, and this could appear to make me unique, that being a Maori atheist would isolate me from my whānau and the wider Maori community. I am the sum total of all my experiences. I am Maori. My worldview is different to New Zealanders. It is set in the tikanga of my people, our history, our whakatauki. These are some of the taonga that have shaped my life. So I put it to you that I'm not alone or unique, and that historically we Māori were skilled at rationalising a critical situation, and to a greater extent we're politically astute and very sceptical of the reasons behind the religiously imperialistic colonisation of Aotearoa. He aha te mea nui o te ao. He tangata, he tangata, he tangata. What is the most important thing in the world? It is the people, the people, the people. This whakatauki is one of the most important core values of my people, and it is one of many of our philosophical sayings that sit comfortably with the values and principles of the New Zealand Rationalist and Humanist Association. We, the Indigenous people of Aotearoa, are descendant from a profound oral tradition. When we return to our past, we return to our ancestors. Our literature has thousands of whakatauki, proverbs that have been passed down through time by our tūpuna, treasures that enlighten Māori history and Māori law. One of our whakatauki says, mea hoki whakamuri, ki ahu whakamua ka neke. In order to improve and move forward, we must reflect back to what has been. So haere mai ki ahu, come with me and let's travel back into our past. My third great-grandparents, Tuka and Tumoana, were born before the arrival of the Pākehā in the house of Ngāpuhi at Pākengapā in the Hokianga. At that time, our tūpuna led a highly developed social, political and material life. We had forts, villages, wharapuni, small houses by the sea, plantations, jewellery, toys, clothes, catamarans, generals, warriors, healers, ariki, artists, weavers, gardeners and mana atua, deities. Māori did not worship their deities. They were an integral part of the world, to be acknowledged and respected as an important part of what kept the world in balance, having a particular regard for the use and sustainability of resources. There was no devil or hell, nor was there any prayer. The Māori word karakia is misused and misunderstood. It is not begging for divine intervention. It is simply a chant that pays respect to mana whenua, the boundaries and land that lay in their care. It is an appeal to the people present to help maintain a balanced debate for a peaceful outcome to the proceedings of the day. The relationship between the European and his God and Māori and their mana atua is hugely and fundamentally different. The God of the European is omnipresent and omnipotent, and you as a believer are to dedicate your life to him and his law, or burn in his eternal hell. For Māori, mana atua was a connected part of a whole fabric within which mana atua and tangata whenua are one. No one was omnipresent. All worked to maintain a balance and synergy of life energies. Māori have a long tradition of interhapu relationships and alliances for common purposes. Regional alliances were used to strengthen major projects such as trade and to protect authority in land. Our rangatira would gather together once a year at harvest time to discuss political and economic strategies. These meetings were an opportunity for rangatira and other decision makers to exercise a collective decision in communal governance. Our rangatira used the meetings to apply tikanga, law, to new situations and to develop strategy for common purposes. So with the existing inter-regional and inter-island travel and trading networks, the arrival of the first Pākehā, whalers and sealers to our shores did not go unnoticed. It was a small step for our tūpuna to extend their trade to meet the demands of the Europeans. By the 1800s, Ngāpuhi had become key producers and suppliers of agricultural produce. They invested in agricultural equipment, flour mills and coastal vessels, and produced, processed and transported produce to markets. They were also involved in the kauri spar and flax trade. They purchased trading ships and schooners. Ships owned by Nene, Pomare and others were circumnavigating the world and were sailing to San Francisco, Boston, China, Britain and Sydney. Ngāpuhi were supplying food to prisoners and their jailers at Port Jackson. It was estimated that by 1840, 1,000 Ngāpuhi had travelled overseas to a total of 69 countries. By now, Ngāpuhi was so familiar with the non-Māori world, both through European visitors and through their own travel, that it should come as no surprise that in 1808, 6 years before the arrival of the first missionaries, a confederation of Northern Hapu was established specifically to deal with the European world. When the first settlers and missionaries arrived in Aotearoa, they were completely dependent on our tūpuna for support and help, even though they had never shown any reason to deserve this assistance. The early 19th century missionaries saw the relationships between our tūpuna through a biblical frame and regarded Māori traditions as products of sinful paganism that should be abandoned for their so-called civilised Christian practices. Our tūpuna were courteous to the missionaries, but made no secret of the fact that their presence was only tolerated for economical gain. I have no doubt that it is at this point in our history that our rangatira started to use the Christian religion to access the corridors of European power. The missionaries were a community of religious zealots, bloated with self-righteousness, insensitive to the smell of their own stench, and blind to the filth, squalor and wretchedness of their own oppressed people. They were an advanced guard of smiling, sanctimonious assassins full of racial and cultural superiority, armed with that revolting, odious Jew production called Bible, which every pious villain in European history has used for thousands of years to justify their vile atrocities. They were here to convert Māori to Christianity, to steal our land, our identity and culture. To assimilate or exterminate us was their prime principle. These are the people who called our tūpuna heathens, dirty savages, filthy barbarians, and with no proof or credible witnesses, they fabricated, propagandised and perpetuated a deadly web of lies accusing our tūpuna of cannibalism, an accusation that is used effectively to demonise and dehumanise the indigenous race of every country that the Europeans have plundered. William Ahrens, the author of The Man-Eating Myth, noted that the belief in cannibalism is a universal phenomenon that has been exhibited in all inhabited regions of the world. Ahrens also notes that accusations of socially sanctioned cannibalism in a society typically arise from an alternative society with whom they are in conflict. The early Romans labelled Christians as cannibals, and Christians in medieval Europe labelled Jews as cannibals. The accusation of cannibalism is the most frequently used weapon that racists, bigots, the ignorant and the sly have been using against Maori and other Indigenous people for centuries. Our library shelves are littered with second-hand biographies of early missionaries and settlers in praise of their own heroic past. The truth is that the early pioneer was totally out of control. Alcohol, morphine, cocaine, cannabis, opium, sexual promiscuity, incest, murder and prostitution were rampant and widespread. Stephen Eldred Grigg, the author of Pleasures of the Flesh, Sex and Drugs in Colonial New Zealand, 1840 to 1915, wrote, Dunedin whores carried out much of their business in brothels along Walker Street, where they formed a precinct known as the Devil's Half Acre. It covers an area of almost 3 acres in extent and is dotted over with 50 or 60 hovels, or what might better be described as dog kennels, which are inhabited by the lowest class of prostitutes and thieves. These hovels mostly contain only one compartment in which ordinary man cannot stand, and are owned by 2 or 3 God-fearing landlords. The despicable acts of depravity by the early colonists and missionaries and the crimes that they committed against my people are all hidden or relegated to one line in the annals of time. The early missionaries and settlers had no idea of the complexity of Māori society, so they were shocked at how quickly our tūpuna took to learning English. Our tūpuna took to this new language with enthusiasm. Literacy and expanding numeracy were 2 new, exciting concepts that they clearly saw as an advantage. As they learned this new language, they passed their knowledge on to others. They set up their own schools, and they taught each other how to read and write. Our tūpuna embraced this new language so successfully that we know today that in the 1830s, a higher proportion of our tūpuna were more literate than the settlers. One of our most important Māori political landmarks was instituted on the 28th of October in 1835 by James Busby and 34 Northern chiefs, who gathered together in Waitangi to sign a Declaration of Independence of the United Tribes of New Zealand, which recognised Māori sovereignty over New Zealand. Article 2 of the Declaration stated that they had the power and chieftainship over the land. They would never hand that chieftainship over to someone else, and they and their gatherings would set the laws. One of those rangatira was my tūpuna, Tamiti Wakanene. For me, the notion that 500 of our rangatira woke up one morning brimful of joyful loyalty to King William IV and blithely gave away their country and their authority is and should always be seen as ludicrous. By 1819, the missionaries, desperate to convert Māori to Christianity, did the unforgivable and started trading muskets to Ngāpuhi. There is no doubt that this trade contributed to the devastating musket wars that followed. In the decades that followed, our tūpuna fought for survival. The musket wars, the land wars, dislocation, disease, and social and economic changes had a serious effect on the physical and psychological health of our tupuna and a devastating impact on our population. Diseases that were brought to this country were measles, influenza, typhoid fever, dysentery, tuberculosis and venereal infections, the latter being first introduced by James Cook and his crew. The influenza epidemic struck Maori communities 5 times harder than the European, and it is estimated that we lost half of our population. Many of our tupuna saw these diseases as punishment from the Christian God. They were disabled, weak and confused. Their own medicine was ineffective, and the fabric of their society was breaking down. This presented an opportunity which the Christian community could not ignore. With the instinct of a predator sensing the vulnerability of our tupuna, and with the fire of the just burning in their bellies, they set about converting many Māori to their Jewish god of war. Our rangatira, including my second great-grandparents, Pākenga Nuku and Karepe Tarahanga, rallied enough to prepare for the next political onslaught that came in the guileful disguise of Christopher William Richmond. Richmond was elected to Parliament in 1852 and was the Minister of Native Affairs between 1858 and 1860. Richmond knew nothing about our culture or land tenure, collective ownership, and under legislative procedure had a bill passed through Parliament to destroy what he called the beastly communism of Māori society by forcing our tupuna into the British system of private land ownership. The Native Land Court, by fraud and deceit, were then able to systematically strip us of our land. By 1860, almost the entire South Island had been stolen from our tupuna. Not only did this law destroy successful iwi businesses, but it also locked us into the Māori land courts for every generation yet to be born. There is no doubt in my mind that Richmond lit the flame that started the land wars. It was during this period that our tupuna started to leave the towns. Settlers and Māori were now moving along separate political paths. By now it had become blatantly obvious that the Pākehā were only interested in our land. Our tupuna had become superfluous. It didn't take long for our tupuna to become disillusioned with Europeans, the musket wars, the land wars, political corruption, and the part that the churches played during those wars caused political unease and led our tupuna to lose interest in Christianity. This was the catalyst that led Māori toward the founding of new Māori sectarian organisations. My grandfather, Rātapu Ngāore Pākenga, was born in, have to go back. Right. This growing dislike and distrust of the Christian religion and political corruptness paved the way for the first kingitanga movement of the Waikato. One of the acknowledged leaders of the kingitanga movement was our rangatira Te Puia Herangi. The kingitanga movement was originally set up by the Tainui iwi to protect their land and identity. Te Puia threw all of her strength into making it part of the central focus of all Māori people. Over the next few decades, other movements followed. The Ringatu, Pai Marere, Te Hauhau, Te Whiti and Tohu movements, all of them represented a protest against the invasion and growing dominance of Pākehā power. My grandfather, Rātapu Ngāore Pākenga, was born in the Hokianga in 1871, and my grandmother, Titi Kāwhare Timor, was born in Thames in 1875. My grandparents were the last in my whānau to be joined by Tomo, an arranged political marriage between Ngāti Hako, Ngāti Tamatera, o Te Hauraki and Ngāpuhi. They lived in the Hokianga most of their lives, and my grandfather overpaid the church in land for the dubious honour of having his children educated at the Hokianga Native School, where they were taught how to be good, pious Pākehā. It was at this school where they suffered the indignity of having their beautiful Māori names replaced with English ones, and where they were whipped and beaten for speaking Te Reo Māori. In my grandfather's time, land was still being taken by force and fraud. the 4 parliamentary seats that had been introduced in 1868 were powerless, and legislation that was introduced to put a stop to this wholesale land grab was ineffective. Our tupuna were plagued with these problems. It didn't matter where they turned, there seemed to be no mechanism to redress the situation in the colonial bureaucracy. So in 1892, members of the Kotahitanga movement came together to form a Maori parliament. A structure was agreed to, including national elections. The focus of the parliament was legal validation from the New Zealand Parliament and retention of Māori land. Bills passed by the Maori Parliament were then introduced into the colonial parliament but were either ignored or defeated. However, such was the determination of our tupuna to seek justice that the Kotahitanga Māori Parliament continued sitting until their final meeting in 1902. Meanwhile, trickling on the side, a group of young Māori students who attended Te Aute College in the Hawke's Bay region formed the Te Aute Students' Association. Later they were to call themselves the Young Māori Party. They were formally constituted as a political party in 1909. Their purpose was to improve Māori health, revive Māori morale and achieve economic prosperity. Prominent members were Apirana Ngata, Peter Buck, Maui Pomere, Tutere Wirepa, Rewete Kohere, Edward Pohua Ellison and Frederick Bennett. In the 1920s, the Ratana movement was born. Ratanism swept through Māoridom like wildfire. Its impact was nationwide and extended beyond the shores of New Zealand to Europe, Asia and the United States of America. Ratana Pass soon became the mecca of thousands of Māori. Although it had begun as a religious faith-healing movement, by 1923 it was obvious that the Ratana Church was becoming a major and threatening political force. In 1924, Ratana and a delegation of 30 took a petition that was signed by 40,000 Māori, laying out the grievances which called for the return of confiscated land and the implementation of the Treaty of Waitangi to King George V of England and the League of Nations in Geneva. Undaunted by the refusal of a hearing from George V and the League of Nations, they travelled on to Japan, Scotland, Ireland and Wales, followed in the next year by a similar visit to the United States of America. This world caught international interest and placed Māori grievances firmly on the political world stage. Viewed in the light of the political movements of its forerunners and considering the deterioration in the circumstances of our tupuna and their still unrequited land claims, emergence of such a personality as Tahu Pōtiki Uremu Ratana is not surprising. Unlike the preceding Māori political movements, which were mainly of a local nature and restricted to certain districts, the Ratana movement knows no territorial or tribal boundaries. The Ratana movement had a New Zealand-wide influence and, as such, affected all the tribes in the country. Ratana declared that he would control Ngā Hau e Whā, the 4 winds. At other times he would say his power would extend to Ngā Koata e Whā, the 4 corners of Aotearoa. Speaking figuratively, and in a language appealing and comprehensible to us Māori, he meant that his influence would be felt throughout the length and breadth of Aotearoa. Ratana was not referring to religious influence, but the political influence which his movement was to have on New Zealand as a whole. It was in 1943 that his political aspirations were finally realised, when all 4 of the Māori constituents were represented by members of the Ratana movement. Constituencies, sorry darlings. This was a remarkable achievement for a movement which on its first entry into the political field was derided by critics, mainstream religions and sceptics as being doomed to early failure. In the following years, the political movement became established within the parliamentary Labour movement. Growing in stature, it reached the height of its political power when the Ratana members held the balance of power in the Parliament of 1946 to 1949. Ratana members of Parliament were fortunate in that they were able to share the credit for the spectacular advances in Maori well-being that followed the election of the first Labour government. The giants of the past, Carroll, Ngata, Buck, Pomare, all had spoken eloquent words in Parliament, but none had been able to improve the lot of their people to the same extent. Excuse me. My father, Hugh McKinney, was born in Auckland. He was a building inspector until his life was interrupted by the European Second World War. He was a gunner in the 9th Heavy Regiment of the New Zealand Artillery and spent his service years in North Africa. He was an atheist, a socialist and a political activist, and spent a large part of his life combating racist and religious propaganda. My siblings and I were encouraged to think critically and to reject the teachings of dogmatic superstition. Both of my parents made sure that we were aware of the deeper, larger issues of the world around us. My mother, Hemanarori Pākenga, was born in the Hokianga. She was a disillusioned Catholic and a tireless advocate for social justice. I have strong memories of every religious zealot in Auckland beating a path to our doorway to try and convert her to their church. It was clear that they saw a native who needed saving, and they were doing their damnedest to get her back into the religious fold. She would listen to their fire and brimstone sermons and then send them politely on their way. I have never forgotten the pompous, patronising, arrogant and imperious attitude that they displayed toward my mother and us children. My mother was a strong woman who, through the Maori Women's Welfare League, was able to work effectively towards social transformation for her people. Some of my mother's whānau lived in the Hokianga and some lived in the Hauraki. So our home, being the centre of these two places, was the stopover and departure base for uncles and cousins who departed for the European Second World War in the 28th Māori Battalion to North Africa, and for whānau who had to travel to Auckland to attend the Māori land court seeking justice for the land that was stolen from our iwi. I attended some of the court hearings with my mother and aunties. The court attendant would call out names of landowners. If they were absent, it was because they had not been notified of the court hearing, or they could not afford to travel such a long distance, let alone find accommodation for a court sitting they had no guarantee of even taking place. I watched and listened. They would call a name, no answer. Bang, the judge would bring down a stamp and the land of the absentees went to the Crown. My aunties would yell at the judges, calling him a thief, but he was like a robot. Stamp, stamp, stamp. Hundreds of thousands of acres disappeared into the government coffers. I was born in a state house at Orake, Auckland in 1942. My home was a hub of political activity, a place of refuge and warmth. I had a carefree early childhood, blissfully unaware of the dark undertones and the harsh reality of the lives of my elders. We were a short walking distance from Ngāti Whātua Pā and the wealthy street of Paratai Drive. It was in this environment that I observed the difference in the living standards of my school friends, from the opulence and sumptuous wealth of one group to the poverty of the other. Even so, I have to say that we children of Orake, Pākehā and Māori were like any other kids of our time and played happily together, running freely between the Pā, a state house and a castle on the hill. However, it was an observation that I never forgot, and it set the stage for another direction in my life. I was a young girl when I learned my first hard lesson about racism and bigotry. It was on a beautiful sunny day in Auckland when I was by my mother's side as we boarded a bus in Auckland City to journey home to Orake. Mother asked for 2 tickets to Orake. The bus driver's face screwed up as he spat at my mother and screamed at her to pronounce Orake the English way, which is Auraki. My mother looked at him calmly and refused to bend to his demands, so we were thrown off the bus. My mother took my hand and we walked the 7 kilometres home. This experience made a deep impression on me. One of many cruel, racist incidents involving my mother that I witnessed as a child. Didn't take long to learn that 2 and 2 equaled Christian bigot. I was 10 years of age when I witnessed the government eviction of Ngāti Whātua from their pā at Okahuhu Bay at Orake, Auckland. I was standing outside the pā with my eldest siblings while my mother and father fought beside their whānau to help and support the last of those who were still resisting relocation. The government torched the pā. I can still smell the smoke. I can still see the flames. I can still hear the screams, the wailing of our queer. One of our kaumātua threw himself back into his burning home as others were carried or dragged out of the pā. Many of our elders died within a year of being evicted. I was completely traumatised by the horror that I saw, and I will carry those images with me until the end of my days. I became a member of the Maori Women's Welfare League in my late teens, where I had the privilege of working beside one of Māoridom's greatest fighters for justice, Rangatira Whenua-Kupa. Our main task at that time was improving the living conditions for Māori who were moving to the city and faced racist discrimination in housing and employment. I became a Labour Party member in my 20s and a member of the New Zealand Rationalist Association in the early 1970s. These organisations were the perfect vehicle for resisting the burgeoning influence of Christianity in our parliament, the emergence of the sharpening class struggle, and the growing monopolisation of capitalism. It soon became blatantly obvious to my generation that the old avenues used by our tūpuna to pursue their claims for redress of many wrongs were full of blind alleys maintained by successive governments to frustrate and eventually dishearten them. The land courts, the validation courts, the appeal courts, the Supreme Court, and petitions to Parliament itself, all were the scene of so many costly failures to Māori that they eventually fell into disuse. So the fight against the exploitive, religious and oppressive foundations on which religious capitalism had been established in New Zealand was taken on by my generation to a new and different, urgent level, culminating in modern Maori political activism. The Maori Renaissance had begun. From the 1960s to the 1990s, nothing stood in our way. New Maori movements were organised and were openly active everywhere, from the violence that erupted at the University of Auckland when a group of our men, He Taua, prevented engineering students from staging yet another mock-haka that belittled and denigrated us Maori women, to the anti-apartheid movement, the Matakiti Not One More Acre of Land March, Ngā Tamatoa, the Warriors Brown Power movement, the occupation of Raglan Golf Course, the occupation of Ngāti Whātua Pā at Bastion Point in Auckland, Heart, the Halt All Races Tour, the anti-racist movement, the women's liberation movement, the anti-Vietnam movement, the formation of the Mana Mutahaki Māori political party and the Māori Organisation on Human Rights movement, to the reclaiming and the rise of our art and waiata, the Te Papa Art Exhibition to New York, the Kohango Reo Māori Language Nests, the Māori Language Act 1987, a piece of legislation which gave Te Reo Māori official language status, and the Treaty of Waitangi Claims. All of these movements were so successful that the perception of Māori went from being that of a dying race to being politically, culturally and artistically ascendant. If we rationalise the history of my race, it is clear that no one can say that our customs have held us back. It is clear that we were not the hapless primitive savages that religious and other historians have portrayed us as. It is clear that we have constantly adapted and responded to new needs and ideas, and that we have successfully met and challenged the changing political and religious landscape of New Zealand. So no one should be shocked by the latest figures released from the New Zealand Statistics Department, which state that in the 2013 census, the Indigenous Maori population stood at 598,600 and 263,600 Maori ticked the no religion box. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.